We are talking today about geopolitics, and we'll see what happens. So basically a bit of backstory here. So this guy here, Dario, was the original author of a paper called Can Open Source Secure Europe's Digital Infrastructure? Basically, the interesting point here, you can access the article there in the QR code, is this is coming from a think tank in Spain on geopolitics and international politics. And this is the first time, to the best of my understanding, that this is happening in Spain. I was advising in the open source space, let's say, and it's in English. It's one of those first places where you see, well, something is happening around, right? So there is this photo. This happened like a couple of months later. There are some folks around. Claire is around here in this photo, somewhere here. And basically, this is a diverse group of people that came together to discuss about this topic specifically and what is the role of open source here. So we have people from different geographical regions, like USA, or coming from China, Europe, coming from private companies, public companies, cybersecurity. There were people from national security in Spain, researchers. So there are a bunch of people that were discussing about the topic there at Elcano Royal Institute. Some of the topics that were discussed, we were talking about open source as digital infrastructure. There were concepts that were around as digital colonization. So there were some good discussions happening and putting together. This happened the day after, which is the Digital Resilience Forum. That was another conference that we ran in Madrid on the 29th of October. You have another QR code in case you want to download everything. And then we had some folks from United Nations, Open UK, the Irish government, and CURIOSS and other entities came. Adriana Groff from Sovereignty Tech Agency. And well, basically all were sharing their thoughts about what does it mean. First being digitally resilient, and then at some point, what's the role of open source in all of this? We discussed many things, but we agreed at least that we need to discuss more. And we need some other things. We need research, we need analysis, and then basically we need to share with other stakeholders. Main reason why I'm here, main reason why I was at FOSDEM, basically to share these thoughts and have that, that discussion. A bit about me. So my name is Daniel Izquierdo. I have a PhD on empirical software engineering coming from the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. I'm CEO of co-founder of Bitergia. I'm wearing some other hats in the open source space. So if you have any interest in these topics, happy to share. Some context now. So how open source has changed and evolved during the last years. So this is coming from October. You can see some countries. Well, probably you are aware of this. This is kind of a big change since 30 years ago, where mainly was Europe and the USA producing open source, right? So it means that we are really global nowadays. So it means that we have India, it means that we have China, it means that we have many other countries all around. And this is probably the very first time in history where we really have a global community. It's not only GitHub, these numbers are coming from OSS Compass. OSS Compass is an open source project relying on some CHAOSS technology from the Linux Foundation. And then they are stating similar numbers. They are aggregating the numbers in different ways, but basically you have European Union, United States, doesn't matter the order. The point is that the main players are there, right? And then again, we have China, we have India, we have Brazil and other countries. This is another example coming from the European Commission. Just don't look too much at the numbers, but basically on the left, you have mainly European countries. On the right, you have other countries. Just for comparison. The greener on the top, basically this line here is telling you, well, the public sector is basically more embracing open source, we can call it. And then this line here is basically the private sector. So you can see interesting things like, for instance, in South Korea, which is the last country, is the private sector is embracing open source and is taking advantage of this at a certain level. Then in Europe, for instance, this is mainly happening at the public sector in some cases. So all to say that, yeah, we have this global community. Maybe it's happening in the wrong time in history, because now that we are global, we have all these geopolitical problems. So what do we do, right? So how is open source affected? And then we've been basically focusing on three main aspects, which are regulations, choke point, for instance, the GitHub sanctions, and then how, because open source is everywhere, how this can be used now as a weapon. Basically, we are now at the stage where open source is so important that this is basically part of the geopolitics, right? Some examples. We have US regulations, right? We have this, open source initiative, definition of open source, so no discrimination against persons or group. But then what happens is that each of us, we live in our countries, and we are under the legal umbrella, under the jurisdiction of this country. And that's affecting how I can collaborate with others. That's literally affecting that if I am the USA, I'm not a lawyer here, so there are other lawyers, but I cannot have a private collaboration with Huawei, and that's happening. And me as an open source developer may affect me in different ways. And this is not only happening in the US. The CRA or the AI Act in Europe is basically pointing to the same things. So you are affected by the law, even if you are not in the country. And by the way, this already happened in the past. So maybe you remember the crypto wars, right? In the 90s. So basically you cannot export strong cryptography. And that was affecting open source developers because they were producing browsers and they wanted to bring strong cryptography in the browser. So this is happening, but this already happened. What happens, the main difference nowadays is that we have all these other places, all these other countries that are really producing open source. Other examples, GitHub sanctions. So if you're aware of this paper, basically they claim at the end, well, the developers were able to work around this with VPNs, and then the amount of activity that was produced before versus after, it's basically nothing happened in reality. The main point here is what happens if we don't have access to GitHub, which is where most of the open source software is being developed nowadays. What do we do, right? There are other examples. Probably you're aware, of course, of this example with some developers leaving the community. They are burnout, mental health problems, whatever. The point is that there is social engineering and someone was attacking this. So there is certain fragility in all this ecosystem, right? And by the way, this again happened in 2003, backdoor attack to the Linux kernel, directly going to the servers where the development was happening, trying to change this, right? So there are examples of this happening everywhere. So basically the point is that the problems are not new, but now force is part of the strategy to attack other countries, to attack other corporations. So then where is, all the discussions that you had today about open source, fostering collaboration and everything, how much we can do in reality, right? Last but not least, well, probably you all know that the lack of maintenance in open source, right? So this is an example of Kubernetes. If you check basically the table, the more to the right means that there is a higher risk of something for a certain definition of risk. On the y-axis, we are defining some examples like the growth of active contributors, the lead time for issues, PRs, the pass factor, review efficiency, and other cases. This example is analyzing 400 plus packages in the Go programming language for Kubernetes. Probably you know Kubernetes. 2/3 of them are at risk of lack of maintenance. Hey, we are discussing about Kubernetes here, which is massively used probably by all of you, by your entities or companies or corporations or universities. And we are talking basically, if you think about the usual number of the SBOM, which is like 100,000 open source components, that's like a 0.4%, right? If I'm doing right the numbers. So in that very small space, really well maintained, that is called Kubernetes, we are facing these problems. So there is a lot of, issues that are happening here and there. So some strategies, some things that are happening. USA. Maybe not done in purpose, but this is a way that basically this has been working. We have the main open source foundations in the USA, right? It's where everything we can say partially happened or started, if not mainly. So everything nowadays, the main open source foundations are under USA jurisdiction. And there is, of course, a whole ecosystem of public and private funding. There are great open source projects and companies. So we saw some examples from Malcolm on where this is happening, and it's mainly USA money. And then at the end, basically, there is a certain control of basic infrastructure. So China is trying to build their own thing, and probably they are already done this. And basically, well, Now, if we have all these choke points, if we have all these problems, we'll try to do our own. So then they have Git instead of GitHub. They have OpenEuler, they have OpenHarmony. Probably you're aware of all of these projects. And this is basically to be independent from a technological perspective. So there is no, they cannot attack, they cannot force certain things. And everything is under control, basically, of the government. Of course, we, as living here, we say, well, the lack of open governance might be seen as a threat. And probably it is, but that's our way of thinking. In the case of China, yeah, it's working. What happened here in Europe? Well, we'll see some examples, no? We are on it. So the question basically from a more community perspective is the last one. So can we survive as a really global open source community? And that's the question to solve probably, if we believe that this is the case. A bit of analogy here. Okay, if you think about how we started working and creating connections and, you know, doing commerce, we as monkeys, we started walking at some point, right? So we started having paths, right? So I need to go from A to B because I want to recollect, I want to go hunting, I want to do something. And then it happens that my friend Stephen Wally, at the end, he lives in another town, and I want to visit him because he can sell me some, I know, watermelons, and I can give cherries back. So there is a path here, but there is a moment in time where basically the complexity of all of this is too big. And then we need some other discussions about, okay, how can we really make this happen? Because this is not between A and B, it's basically between the different points. We need something basically bigger to start thinking about this. So there are many problems, of course, lack of coordination, local and regional regulation. Suddenly we start having not paths, but we start having highways. So we need all the services around, we need all the companies. So there is a whole sophistication in all this process. Think of this of software. Software could be basically this. And there are some solutions, right? So we may start discussing about, well, we can have paths of common infrastructure, because this is something that is basically benefiting all of us. We can have some improvements on how we can fund all of these highways. Of course, we need to build a certain legal framework, so then things happen, some services, security, food, accommodation. We have now hotels, you know, all this stuff that if you drive, you see that it's all around this. And basically, at the end, this is treated as a basic facility for all of us. And then we all understand this, and then basically governments, private companies, everyone is investing in having this, you know, at least running. So then what if we start treating open source in this way, kind of a shared infrastructure? And this is where we go. So basically, what? Let me go into this picture first. FOSS has been basically contributing to society in many ways. We've been producing innovation, we've been producing increasing productivity, we've been increasing transparency, we've been bringing knowledge to the society. The problem is that sometimes society is not aware of this. They are really not aware of this. So it's basically part of our journey, it's part of our mission probably as individuals that really understand how this works, to go out there and explain this is happening. Hey, we are bringing all of this. Now society is realizing, oh, we are building our digital blocks in open source. Oh, what do we do? So now suddenly we need to start discussing about, okay, if this is a common good for the society, we need to bring resources, we need to start creating a friendly environment, we need to start having certain space for this innovation to happen. It happens that this has already happened. This is still in progress, right? We are realizing of this path. Who? Basically, we started the journey alone. So, oh, well, I produce open source. This is super cool. I can develop here, whatever. And then that's for me. Now, suddenly we realize that, well, maybe we need to start having some social organizations. Let's call them open source foundations. Because, well, it makes sense from a legal perspective. We are creating certain umbrellas. And then it happens that companies started at some point to consume open source. Now, we start having this discussion with policymakers. It's quite recent, right? But then this is basically what I would say the four pillars that we can go with. And how? Well, that's the question. That depends how fragmented we want our world to be from an open source perspective. I would say we need to go global. and have such conversation with policymakers and everyone. Because someone, I don't remember exactly the example that someone said before about you can work, with this digital sovereignty topic about like a castle, and this is me isolated, or you can have something that is basically collaborative with others, right? I don't remember the example exactly. But we need that coordination, and that has to happen worldwide. So then, kind of summarizing, we need certain support from the society, and then we need the society to not interfere that much into how this is happening. So if something is working, which is called open source, let's leave open source to keep working in such way. I was in September at the Open Source Congress in Brussels that was hosted by the Eclipse Foundation. And there was quite an interesting discussion between two people. One of them was someone from the European Commission, policymaker, I think so, and then the other one was coming from the community. And the person from the European Commission said, well, we are producing all these policies, but I don't have a way to contact all of you. So you are so fragmented that I cannot reach to all of you. And that's probably a fair comment. On the other side, the answer was, so yes, but that's basically the strength of the open source space. This is how we've been competing with each other. This is how we've been growing. This is probably why open source is so resilient. So the thing here, my lesson learned basically is that we've seen, or I've seen at least the first time in life, that there was such discussion and there are some common agreement about, okay, we need to find a bridge. We don't know exactly what, how, but this discussion has to happen, right? Some examples, you are probably aware of some of like Sovereignty Tech Agency. There were some discussions in Spain 20 years ago, because I'm from Spain, I bring the example here. And that was quite interesting because in Extremadura, which is border with Portugal, at the north of Andalusia, this is the poorest region in Spain, but they started with all this political movement about supporting open source, and they have migrated a lot of desktop and other stuff into the open source. So that's a good example of kind of political support that, by the way, is not happening today. That happened. So there are cycles as well, right? So basically, some good examples, United Nations with the UN open source principles. That's another way of fostering open source as the building blocks, of being part of the, giving the right stage probably to open source. And these are friendly examples. The CRA was not that friendly at the beginning, but is now, well, a good output, we can say, from at least the very first steps. Because literally the very first drafts of CRA was killing the industry, was saying, okay, you are dead as an industry. But basically represented kind of a misunderstanding of the policymakers of the real, case for open source, which is basically software industry nowadays. But that's a good example of bringing them together, about policymakers and the open source community. And it's about making this clear difference between, well, producing and testing open source and basically using open source in production, where you start having liabilities. And that's all good. I would say the industry is not not against being regulated, but let's do this without harming open source, right? Well, basically some ideas like maybe some certification procedures. SDB at Eclipse Foundation is another good example of bringing corporations together to try to make the case for open source, and specifically to mutualize risk and to mutualize cost, which is where they are going. What we need is basically to start filling the gaps. That basically this means in somehow supporting open source in different ways. We have Sovereignty Tech Agency in Germany, Open Collective are another ways of governance, Floss Fund that's coming from India as an example. But we need to fund and support research and development, specifically in the case of open source for this. So again, we need this combination and coordination across different actors that we mentioned before, right? Open source projects, foundations, companies, and governments. And given how the industry is moving forward, I would say foundations, open source foundations will play more and more important roles. So it's part of our mission to be sure that those foundations are treating in the right way open source. Where? Basically, as I mentioned, anyone can join. So what's the problem? This is open source, right? So the point is that the rules should be designed to ensure open source role as public good. And then this is part of the infrastructure. Basically, why? Because those joining will benefit, and these are the basics of open source. So we are producing something that might be useful for you. The advantage of doing this first is basically that you are designing this for your own purposes, for your own needs. And if others can join or would like to join, that's perfect, because that means collaboration. You are exporting basically value, and you are importing probably innovation for others coming from the community into your project. So in other ways, what in geopolitics, sometimes they say this is a zero-sum game, but basically I'm against you, so I need to win and you have to lose. In open source, we always discuss about growing the cake. So I think this is one of the places where we can benefit, or everyone can benefit from. There are some problems to solve. There are many of them. It's full of them. All good. We have discussed about probably the three first, which is fragmentation, the lack of investment, and the use of open source as a weapon. But there are others that we still know that exist. Like, for instance, innovation is favored and not driven, or how to ensure incentives. You know, there are academic. I don't remember exactly the title, but there are academic examples stating, well, if you put money here, you are basically harming other areas, where basically that effort is not going into whatever was happening before, but basically where the money is flowing in. So what do we do? Is this the right approach? Well, I don't know. I don't have the answer, so just to say. So we need more experience, we need more experiments, and we need more research. That's where you come from, basically, from the research space. Now, being a European, the question is if Europe is willing to be part of the journey, even leading the journey. And that's part of the discussion. And the point is about if we can collaborate with others, and if others are willing to collaborate here. Because the thing is that there is a whole China open source strategy, Brazil or India, they are doing this. So why? Hi, ahora. Okay. So yeah, collaborate with others, or we are missing again the train. Talking about Europe. No. So I don't know why he didn't add here. This is 1999. This paper was written by my PhD advisor, that was my co-presenter at FOSDEM. It's interesting, at 1999, it was my last year at high school. So just to say, you know, to put things in timing. And there were already discussions like this. And this is an opportunity for Europe and basically on any other country around. So this is not about making the case for Europe, leading anything. It's about making the case for collaboration all across the world. So that's Libre Software, or LibreSoft, is the research group I come from the university. So the question basically is, if we can do it, the question is basically if we believe that open source is driving this innovation, because we say, well, open source is bringing all this collaboration and innovation, etc. But the question really is if you really believe this is the case. Because if that's the case, all the business models presented before by Malcolm are totally applicable here. We just need to make this happen, but not only bring in the private companies, but the public sector as well to bring all of this. And basically, if Europe is probably a good home for open source. Probably you're aware of this, the call is already closed, but this is a European Commission calling for evidence about, well, basically, what would be the strategic approach to the open source sector in the European Union. So there have been, I don't know if thousands of answers, 600, okay, thank you, which is a super great number. So there has been like a massive answer from the community. And if you are following, I don't remember the mailing list, OFE, Open Forum Europe mailing list on the topic, there have been tons of answers basically on the topic, which is super good, because that means that the open source community is now leading part of the discussion to educate policymakers to be part of the discussion, right? And again, we question. No, it's working. It's just the last thing, literally. So basically, again, if we believe that open source is bringing innovation, the question is if we really believe this, because anyone in their countries can simply take the lead, and that's it. And then it's about bringing others and making the space to have such collaboration. And this is all about the talk. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Daniel. I think we think that the battery might be gone on that, so I'll pass that one on to you. Does anyone have a question and or comment that they would like to add to this discussion? We have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, there's
Bastien.
I guess this is more a brainstorming or open discussion for everyone more than me saying things.
Yes, that would be a very open question. I feel like that this problem of mutualizing money for important infrastructure has been kind of solved for other technical commitments like railroads. Is there any comparison that would be relevant comparing the digital world and the physical world of, mutualizing things? Can we put economics researchers on tracks to do this kind of comparisons? Because it feels like we're living this bubble of digital world while we're not.
So let me, well, Claire, maybe you have a comment. So, but at the place where Claire was in Elcano Royal Institute, there was a comment, and the comment was, well, how much is Europe, for instance, investing in physical infrastructure? So what percentage of this would take for supporting the digital infrastructure in this case? And make that case. If Europe is really thinking, for instance, about isolating themselves on something, fork everything, all the things you are using, and start maintaining this. That's an initial number. Then probably that's not going to happen. So then from that maximum number, basically you're going to start going down. And the point is, the point of this is basically, first, if we start doing that, or we follow that policy, we are starting to have fragmentation. That's already kind of happening, right? But that's going to basically foster that faster. The question is about making that more collaborative.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add into that, though. I mean, one of the nice things that I think has happened recently is the discussion from folks like the Digital Tech Agency, when they have talked about the need to invest in this and have received government funding in order to do that. It has not been with just a local EU perspective. And actually, I had a misconception. It's not even just in the context of what the priorities are for Europe. They are looking at the entirety of the digital infrastructure of the world and looking at the projects that are most critical to that, and then they're investing in those no matter where they are. So I would say we have a template now there for what could be done, and they're bringing that as a proposal from a European perspective. So my observation would be that sort of thing is potentially happening. Whether or not it's being done at the scale, to your point, of what's currently happening in the context of physical infrastructure is another question. But one could argue if you create the path that Daniel was talking about, the first path, then we can lay the superhighway afterwards once we know where the path goes. And we've figured out that it's possible to get money from A to B in a good way.